Hey folks, here we have an image from Big Sur, California, and one of the most iconic locations in Big Sur. This is known as Keyhole Arch at Pfeiffer Beach, and I was there for probably I don't know, seventh or eighth time this past November. I go there all the time because my wife's family lives in San Luis Obispo, so it's a pretty short drive up the Pacific Coast Highway. So in November, I was leading a workshop out there in San Luis Obispo and Big Sur, and we photographed the keyhole arch here on a very windy and chilly evening. It was freezing cold and just brutal, probably like 40 to 50-mile-an-hour winds the whole night. We had a storm come through the day before, so there was, or that day rather. And so these clouds overhead were moving by pretty quick, but there's something trickier going on, which I'll go over here in a second. So we have two different exposures here. We have one for the foreground, which includes the arch right here, the rock, the waves, the foreground sand and rocks, all that stuff. And then a separate exposure for the sky. But then I did something tricky with the sky here. Okay, so let's hop over to the raw files. Go over to the images. And you'll see here that we have the two images that we're going to work on. So this is the sky and this is the foreground. Okay. So in this one, I exposed for the foreground to make sure that all of that was nice and exposed. Didn't really care about the sky, and you can see that it blew out quite a bit. And then because the sky was so bright, the sun sets to the west here behind the rock. I took one for the sky just to make sure that I had it nice and exposed. You can even see the moon up there, which I'll probably remove just because it's so small and minuscule, and it doesn't really add anything to the image. So let's just hop right in though. So there's a little trick that I've learned over the years when you're blending two images together, and that's that you want to get the horizon line where you're going to be blending your foreground to your sky. You want to get them somewhat close together. I don't want to just process this sky and have like a black foreground here for the rocks, because then when I go to blend those two layers together, if I don't do it exactly perfect pixel by pixel, you're going to have kind of like a really dark ridge line on these rocks. So you want to get some light into the foreground here. Okay, so at first, let's kind of focus on the sky and make sure that that looks really nice. But then I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so the first thing is when we're looking at the sky, we want to make sure that we have, plenty of detail. But the main thing that's going to make the sky pop is contrast and vibrance. So we're going to really kind of bring out the colors, bring up the brightness, but then also make sure that we have, our highlights in check. And then I'll come down here to the saturation. So you can click on this little icon here and then just pop right there and say whatever is right there, I want to bring that up. So you can see over on the right hand side that it's bringing up mainly oranges, but it's also bringing up the reds a little bit. So I definitely want those colors to pop. You don't want to bring them up too much because it'll start looking unnatural, like right there. So just probably right in that range right there. I think the blues are probably fine where they are. But guys, that's really it as far as the color and the exposure goes. The next thing I want to do is make sure that I don't have any spots that are not supposed to be there in the sky, like dust spots and distractions. So to address that, we'll go over to the spot healing brush right here. And to really make sure that we can see the spots, you can hit the A key, which will give you this visualize spots palette. Now you can also get to it by just clicking this checkbox down here. And then this slider here will change how sensitive it is to showing dust spots. So you can see right here, we can't really see this spot up here at all. But as we pull this slider over, you can start seeing that dust spot is really apparent. Okay, so I think that's the only one we really have to worry about, just that one spot there. So we'll draw over that, and then we'll go ahead and get rid of the moon here. Okay, good. And let's hit A again and make sure that those two spots look good, which they do. Okay, so here's where I'm talking about here is where I was talking about the foreground. What I want to do is just take my shadows and blacks and just bring some detail into the foreground, just like that. Now I could use this as a single image, but it's a little bit too dark, and I don't want to really push the pixels too far. Because if you bring too much detail into the shadows, your image is going to kind of start to break down a little bit, and you don't want the pixels to break down. So you got to be really careful with that. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is hop over to the next image, and here we're just looking at the foreground. Okay, so let's just start over. So we'll bring the exposure up to get as much detail into those rocks as possible. But then we want to bring the highlights back for the water here. Okay, same thing with the whites. We'll pull that back. May have gone too far with the exposure there. We can also counteract that with some shadows. All right, then I'm going to hit it with some contrast. And contrast is really where the image starts to kind of come to life. Okay, so something like that. A little bit more in the shadows. Bring up the vibrance a little bit and the warmth. I'm just making small little changes here and there to make the image look good. All right, so probably right about there. I don't want to go too much further. So, okay, we're gonna leave it right there. And then I'm not gonna worry about the dust spots up here, because I'm going to use the sky from the other exposure, so we don't need to worry about the sky. But what I will do is come down here and click the remove chromatic aberration and see what the profile correction looks like. In this case, I think I'm going to leave it checked off. Go back here because I forgot to do it with this image, remove chromatic aberration. Now you want to make sure that you don't leave the profile correction on with one image and off on the other, because it changes the pixel to pixel alignment of the image. You can see that when I click that, it kind of makes the image change all over. So you want to make sure that either both of them are on or both of them are off. Now, when I go between the images here, I want to make sure that the exposure of the sky and the foreground are somewhat similar. And I think we're pretty close. Oops, went too far there. So with that done, let's go ahead and take both of these images. I'll shift click the next one over and then right click either or, go to edit in and open as layers in Photoshop. And then we'll hop over there. Okay, so now that we're in Photoshop, we'll get right into blending these two layers together. In this case, it's going to be pretty easy because we have a very well-defined difference between the foreground and the background. There's no trees to mask through or anything complicated like that. In a case such as this, you can really just do it with a single brush stroke. And I say that, but let's see how well it actually works. Okay, so what we need to do is blend this foreground with this background. And we're going to do that by placing a mask on the top layer. So we'll do that by just coming down here and clicking the mask icon. Okay, and then we're going to invert the mask to black. So what that does is it puts a black mask over this layer. And a black mask conceals, so it hides that layer and it shows us anything beneath it, which in this case is this layer down here. So that's why when we look over here, all we can see is this layer. So what we need to do with this black mask is punch a hole in it, which we'll do by using a white paintbrush. And wherever that white paintbrush is, will show us whatever is on that layer, which is this sky. Okay, so hit B to bring up your paintbrush. And we're gonna just go ahead and paint with 100% opacity at first. And we'll make our brush a little bit smaller. Probably like right around there. Right there. Okay, and then we're gonna paint with white. So we'll hit X to switch that to white. And then we're gonna paint right along the edge here. Okay, and you can see like right there, it looks a little bit weird. I'm not too worried about that. We'll fix that here in a second. Right along there. Okay, so now we have our baseline just along the ridge. Okay, now I'll hop over here and then fill this in. Just make sure it's all nice and white. Okay. Option click the mask, and then we need to fix this up over here. So I'll switch to 50% when I'm doing, like touch-up work. That looks fine there. All right. And then I'm just gonna, wherever I can tell that there's an obvious transition, I'll go in with the brush and kind of just touch it up a little bit, like so. There we go. All right, and it's as easy as that, guys. So this is before and after. Again, like I went over in the last video, you can make these edges even a little bit more feathered by just double clicking the mask and bringing up this feather right here. And you have to kind of bring it up way, way high before you start really noticeably seeing the change. So you can just do that, option click it again, do your before and after. And I think what that did, I made it a little bit too pronounced or too feathered. So I'm getting a little bit of haloing here. So I'll double click it and bring it back. Okay, so somewhere around there. And that, I think, is a pretty good transition to the sky. So now all we have to do is finish processing the photo. Okay, so we're just gonna make a few slight adjustments here. I always like to use either the levels or the curves layer, adjustment layers to make these changes. So right now I'm just gonna be focusing on the rock and making that kind of pop. So we'll bring the midtones and highlights to the left and then bring our shadows to the right. And now if we do toggle this on and off, you can see the slight change that it made there. Once that's done, we'll invert the mask to black and then we'll just paint it in manually here. Okay, so right here, paint it in. These are very subtle changes, okay? Not making anything drastic here. But it's just gonna make that rock feature pop a little bit more. And we can probably also add it to the foreground here, and it'll make that look nice. Yeah. Okay, so this is before and after. Next thing I wanna do is bring out a little bit more detail in the water here. So again, levels adjustment layer, and I'm gonna bring the midtones over just a little bit, like so. Invert the mask with Command or Control I, and then just manually paint this into the water here. Like so. All right, so that's before and after. See that? Okay, I don't think there's a whole lot more to do. The image looks really nice from here. So we'll do the typical sharpening and everything. So to do that, we're gonna do Shift, Option, Command E to merge all of our layers together. Now we have an image that we can work with to sharpen. So we'll do Filter, Other, and then High Pass. 3 pixels, good. And then we'll do Overlay. And once again, I don't want to sharpen the entire image. So I'll hold down the Option key to put a black mask over this. And then I'll just paint it in to the rocks. Let's do 70% opacity and then just paint it in right here. With something as subtle as sharpening, you don't really have to be that precise with your masking. You just want to make sure that it doesn't bleed over the edges into the sky. But you won't be able to see these brush strokes or anything. All right, hop up to 80% to paint the foreground here. Definitely want to make sure the sand has a nice pop to it. There we go. Okay, I think that looks good. Now, normally I would say to sharpen last. You usually want to do that, but I just want to double check one thing. I'll do the claw again, Shift Option Command E. And what that's going to do is going to let me go over to my channels and command click the RGB channel. So we'll hop back over, and with that selection, I'm going to hit Command J. Now this is kind of weird, but it gives us this really funky looking layer right here. But what it's done is we've created a luminosity mask, which is a selection of the 50% brightest pixels in the scene. And then we use that selection to create a new layer. So it gives us this really weird looking result. At this point, we don't really need this new layer that we selected. We just needed something for the channels to look at, so we can delete that. But from here, you just take this layer and set it to overlay. And what it does is it kind of just gives you this punch, and it gets rid of all the murkiness in the scene. And I went over this in post 1 as well. If overlay is too much, you can go to soft light, and it's a little bit more subtle. And then if that's still too much, you can just pull the opacity back a little bit, like so. But I think that looks pretty good right about there, before and after. Just another subtle little trick you can do there. But I think that's a good place to stop. So hope you guys learned a few things from here, blending multiple layers together to bring in more dynamic range into the scene. And you don't have to do HDR. That's the great thing. You don't need HDR photography to do this, because those results usually end up way too unrealistic and way too overcooked. Doing it manually like this gives you full control of the blend, and it produces a much more natural result. So, all right, guys, thanks.